Welcome. I hope you are having a wonderful night, dear viewer. Tonight, I will be telling some terrifyingly scary stories. Make sure to leave your feedback on the comments so I can make this the best experience for you. And if you have any stories you would like me to tell, you can send them through the link in the description. Let's begin. Story 1. It was a quiet suburban town in Queensland, Australia, where my roommate and I, childhood friends, lived. Both of us were nearing the end of our university studies. I should mention that I'm using a temporary account for this narrative, as I fear the person involved might somehow trace it back to me. The unsettling events began approximately 2 months ago, with the most recent incident occurring just last weekend. It was a night like any other. About 2 months ago, when I found myself lying in bed, engrossed in a soccer game on TV, drifting in and out of sleep. I often relied on the background noise to lull me into slumber. At that moment, I teetered on the edge between consciousness and sleep when I heard an urgent pounding on the front door. My bedroom was positioned about 10 meters away from the door, overlooking the front courtyard. The unexpected knocks startled me, and I lay frozen, unsure if the sound had been a product of my imagination. I remained perfectly still in the silence, hoping to discern any additional noises. I knew it couldn't have been my roommate, who was away visiting family and attending a wedding for the week. Moments later, a second forceful knock resounded, but no voices accompanied it. Despite my usual affinity for horror movies and a disposition not easily frightened, I found myself immobilized, unable to move. No further knocks followed, but the fear lingered, preventing me from falling back asleep. Exhausted, I finally managed to rest around 4 a.m. The following morning, I called my roommate, seeking answers, but she was just as perplexed as I was. A week passed, and I gradually dismissed the incident from my mind. I concluded that perhaps a drunken person had mistakenly targeted our house, mistaking it for their own, given that it had occurred on a Saturday night. I worked a few night shifts at a large chain grocery store, typically ending between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Then 4 a.m. The subsequent Saturday arrived, and as I neared the end of my shift, my roommate texted me, informing me that someone was knocking on the front door again. Although I wasn't present, the same fear that had gripped me the week before resurfaced. She assured me that all the doors were securely locked, but remained anxious due to the eerie similarity with my experience. She kept in touch with me until my shift ended, revealing that there had been no second knock. Upon arriving home, I observed an undisturbed front yard, devoid of anyone strolling along the street. I must emphasize that our neighborhood was tranquil, with many elderly couples residing on our street. The following morning, my roommate still appeared shaken, prompting me to submit an anonymous tip to a Crime Stopper service. However, I never received a response. For the next month and a half, nothing of note occurred. Both my roommate and I went about our lives as though the incidents had never transpired. Nonetheless, I discontinued working Saturday nights, as that was the sole commonality between the two occurrences. But that all changed on the most recent Saturday. It was 1 a.m., and I sat alone in the living room, indulging in some old episodes of Black Mirror, eagerly anticipating the new season. The lounge room was situated right next to the front door, with a path leading to it that passed by a large window. While engrossed in the show, I noticed the outside motion sensor light activate from beneath the blinds at the bottom of the windowsill. My body stiffened. Until that moment, I had completely forgotten about the previous knocking incidents. But now fear consumed me. Shortly after, bang, bang, bang. Initially, my intention was to remain seated and wait for the person to leave. However, after a second thunderous knock, I mustered the courage to quietly approach the people and see if the visitor was someone familiar. I entertained the notion that it might be one of my roommate's exes, as those relationships hadn't ended amicably. It wasn't. Instead, I beheld a woman. She stood motionless, fixated on the front door. Her eyes bore into mine through the peephole, devoid of expression. It felt as though she could see straight into my soul. I was paralyzed. She continued to stand there for what seemed like an eternity, until suddenly, she glanced to the side and swiftly ran off. Disturbed by the encounter, I promptly contacted the police. Recounting the event over the phone, they dispatched an officer who conducted a cursory examination of the parked cars on the street, but found no evidence of tampering. They advised me to call back if any further incidents occurred. What haunted me the most was the woman's emotionless stance and her subsequent sprint. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, possibly 40s, wearing a thin nightdress and no shoes, a peculiar sight considering the freezing temperature outside. Since then, I've acquired a doorbell camera as a precaution, in case she returns. Yet, truth be told, I still flinch at the sound of any knock on that door. The harrowing experiences have left me on edge, with a persistent feeling of unease. The mystery of those knocks and the enigmatic woman linger in my thoughts, casting a shadow over my once tranquil suburban existence. Story 2. This story I'm about to narrate happened back in February of 1988, when I was just 8 years old. Now, as I approach my mid-40s, the memory of that night still fills me with massive anxiety. To provide some context, I'm a male and have always been the shortest person in my class, with a smaller body frame. At that time, I was living with my mom, my stepdad, and my older sister, who was 3 years older than me. Due to our extreme poverty, we found ourselves frequently moving from place to place. During the events of this story, we were renting a run-down duplex in Utah. I recall that it was a Wednesday evening, as that was the day of the week when my family would gather around the television to watch America's Most Wanted. It was our routine after the TV show ended around 9 p.m. We would bid each other goodnight and head off to our own bedrooms. Since it was a school night, I usually went to bed around 9. Our duplex had 3 bedrooms, 2 on the main floor and 1 in the basement. My room was on the main floor, down the hall from the living room, while my mom and stepdad's bedroom was adjacent to mine at the end of the hallway. My older sister had her room in the basement. At that age, I was afraid of the dark, so I often slept with my bedroom light on, allowing for perfect visibility. Surprisingly, my parents never objected to this, probably because they didn't pay their bills anyway. We also had a false sense of security living in a small Utah town, so we never bothered locking our front door. However, my mom and her husband always locked their bedroom door every night to prevent us kids from entering unexpectedly. I remember drifting off to sleep shortly after laying down. It must have been around 1:00 a.m. when I was abruptly awakened by a peculiar noise in my room. As I sat up in bed responding to the noise, I was horrified to see 2 grown men with biker beards, easily towering 6 feet tall, standing in my bedroom doorway. Their slovenly appearance and every detail were visible to me because my light had been left on. These men were blocking the exit from my room, preventing me from running past them. Their evil stares pierced into my eyes, and I was petrified. In a moment of complete shock, I jumped up from my bed onto my feet, only to realize that my small body wouldn't be able to get past them. My parents' room was directly behind them, and my first instinct was to run to their room. Looking back now, I realize it would have been futile since they were safely and securely locked behind their bedroom door, unaware of what was happening. As my body caught up with my thought process, I changed course and ran to the corner of my room, crouching down. All the while, the 3 of us awkwardly stared at each other. I tried to scream to call for my parents, but in a moment of complete terror, I found myself paralyzed. My attempts to scream turned into silent desperation. I didn't know what these men wanted, and my imagination could only conjure the worst scenarios. One of the men pressed his index finger to his lips silently signaling for me to remain quiet. Trembling with fear, I watched as the second man reached into his pocket and pulled out a 6-inch blade. My room was fairly small, and they were both standing within 4 feet of me. He brandished the knife, making it clear that he wasn't afraid to use it on me. I was terrified, and another attempt to scream yielded nothing. Shortly after, they closed my bedroom door, leaving me alone. Instinctively, I thought they were robbing our house. But now that they were exposed and had threatened me, I hoped they would leave. Little did I know how wrong I was. I waited a few minutes, unsure of whether to open the door and try to pound on my parents' bedroom door. Were they waiting for me behind the closed door? I had no idea. After a few minutes, I mustered up what little courage I had and decided to crawl back into bed, covering myself entirely with the sheet, and waited out. Were they planning on killing my family? I asked myself. Had they already left? What did they want? My anxiety grew as these thoughts raced through my mind. I lay there, listening intently for any sounds, and could hear them moving about the house, opening and closing various kitchen drawers. The walls were paper thin in that cheap duplex, so every move was easily heard. Next, I heard them make their way down the stairs to the basement, where my sister was sleeping. As I listened to every terrifying sound, I desperately hoped that my stepdad would wake up. He was a fairly large man, and these intruders weren't exactly being stealthy. This terrifying ordeal continued for nearly an hour. I lay petrified in bed, my heart pounding as I listened to their every move. To my horror, my entire family slept through the entire ordeal. After some time, I heard the front door shut, and the early winter sun began to rise. My stepdad, who worked in a factory and usually woke up at 5 a.m., was my only hope. I anxiously awaited the sound of my parents unlocking their bedroom door. As soon as I heard their alarm, I left my room and rushed to them, hysterically trying to explain what had just happened. My sister woke up, and I desperately wanted to hear about her night alone in the basement. My parents did their best to calm me down, but tears streamed down my face. I had been traumatized. To my disbelief, my parents dismissed it as a bad dream. They couldn't believe it was possible because, in their minds, they would have surely woken up if anything like that had occurred. However, my sister saw the desperation in my eyes and knew that this was serious. Together, we searched our entire house for any signs of theft. We discovered my sister's dresser drawers left half open and personal items scattered about. This was enough evidence for her to become just as frightened as I was. However, since nothing seemed to be missing, my parents saw no reason to call the police. I was forced to go to school as if nothing had ever happened. A couple of weeks later, while we were watching TV, an update came on about a criminal being captured, someone who had been featured on America's Most Wanted. My heart sank when I recognized the mugshot on the screen as one of the men who had been in my room. However, when I disclosed this to my parents, they were even more skeptical. To this day, I still harbor some resentment towards them. While they slept peacefully behind a locked bedroom door, I had been victimized. Needless to say, I never sleep without locking my door. Thank you for allowing me to share my story. Story 3. I've never really had any reason to be truly scared. Looking back, there isn't one experience I can think of that truly terrified me. I've jumped countless times, from sudden loud noises or catching something move in my peripheral vision. I cannot recall ever fully screaming or shouting, but maybe that's because I'm not a very outspoken person anyway, and would rather mask my feelings from others. I lost my eldest daughter once. She was 2. And we were in Barbecue, a hardware store. They have model bathrooms and kitchens. There I am admiring some taps or tiles or whatever it was. I turn around to the shower she was messing in and poof, gone. That was terrifying. But I wasn't scared. More frantic. Full disclosure, I found her taking a dump on one of the display toilets. Not my proudest moment, having to tell the employee they needed a cleanup in aisle 6. Anyway, so I haven't ever really been terrified. It happened back when I was 17. I'd left school that summer and had 6 weeks before starting college. It was baking hot in the small rural town that I lived in, situated pretty much in the middle of England. It's an old coal mining town, and a bit of British history here. All the mines were closed down, which decimated both the economy and job opportunities of the small pit towns throughout the country. Back to my town. If you're old enough, or at least look old enough, you spend your time in the local pubs. If you're not, you have nothing else to do but roam the streets, seeking your own entertainment. Me and my friends were the latter. On the main road through town, away from other houses, stood a dilapidated house known as the O'Briens. A 4-story, 6-bedroom mansion compared to all the other houses in town. There was an old couple who lived there who, at this point, had passed away some years prior, called, you guessed it, the O'Briens. They had 2 daughters who had moved abroad and had never claimed the house, so it just sat for years, building up dust and rotting away. A perfect opportunity for somewhere cool, private, and exciting for 6 teenagers to hang out. The house had a ridiculously big back garden, which was equally ridiculously overgrown. It literally took us the good part of a day to stomp down a pathway through the nettles and brush. Once through, there was a garage that we could drop down onto, which we pulled up the roof of to gain access. We spent nearly all summer in that house, hanging out, graffitiing the walls, drinking, smoking, etc. But there was one room that eluded us. From the garage, you headed through a kitchen, which now only consisted of a broken window that had been boarded up and a damaged set of cabinets on the back wall. You then stepped into a hallway, which looked right through to the front door, with a bathroom and 2 other large rooms on the left-hand side. On the right were the stairs to the 2nd floor. The staircase was built against a wall and had wooden planks running vertical. Directly opposite the kitchen door, built into the back of the staircase, was a large metal door that had been painted white. The paint now a sickly yellow dusty color and flaky. This door was locked. It simply wouldn't budge. The house was big enough that we just kind of forgot about the locked door. We'd spend most days up in the 2 rooms of the 3rd floor away from the road outside to avoid any passers-by hearing us and phoning the cops. That was until one of the lads decided, for no apparent reason, to light the moth-ridden curtain on fire with a Zippo he was messing with. The curtain, dust-covered carpet, and old crinkled wallpaper went up in seconds. We only made it out by smashing the top window and jumping onto a dirt mound at the side of the garage. I think if adrenaline hasn't been coursing through us, it would have been a hell of a painful fall. We hid in some bushes over the road and watched the fire engine put out the flames. But before that, it had engulfed the 2nd and 3rd floor. The 2nd was still usable once we got the courage to re-enter the house, but the 3rd was gone. Just the outer walls and what was left of the roof. Shame, really. So we were confined to the bottom floor. The garage was too dark to see in, and only had an old table we'd found that you'd normally use to put the paste on wallpaper. We used it to get in and out of the roof. The kitchen wasn't much brighter, and the front room had a big window that overlooked the footpath and road outside, so that left us a small, bleak back room to chill in, which got boring very quickly. Boredom led to curiosity, and I noticed that one of the wooden planks on the side of the stairs was loose, and that there was an open space behind it. Finally, we could see what was behind the metal door. What a mistake that was. They say curiosity killed the cat, but in this instance, it questioned my whole belief. The wooden panels were surprisingly hard to pull off, even for 6 fairly athletic teenagers. So we went out scouting and brought back a few torches and a crowbar. It was still a slog, but we finally managed to remove 2.5 of the panels. Shining the light into the hole revealed another staircase that led downwards. Yet, it looked as though it was decades older than the rest of the house. Cobwebs engulfed every surface, and the stench of musk and damp attacked your nostrils if you got anywhere near the hole. After some giddy behavior, some pushing and shoving, and a game of 6-man rock, paper, scissors, I grabbed a torch and slowly stuck my head through the hole. The room was darker than dark. So dark that the beam from the torch could be seen cutting through the blackness. I shone it down the staircase first. It went down deep. The hole we had made was maybe 4 or 5 steps from the door, and there were at least 25 below it. At the bottom, a wall and a doorway to the left. I swung the torch to the right, towards the metal door, not expecting to see what I saw at all. The door was definitely locked, tight, with 3 separate deadlocks that ran down the side, all barred. But what caught me by surprise was on the small lip of the top step, pushed firmly against the door, was a really outdated fridge, the ones that were squared and about waist high. I told the lads stood behind me and they laughed, thinking I was joking. One by one they stuck their head in the hole, checked out the bottom of the stairs and then the fridge, each one as confused as myself. I remember sitting down, smoking a cigarette and debating how and why it would be there. The door clearly opened inwards, which meant the door must have been locked from the inside. Then somehow the fridge put up against it from the inside. We spent the rest of the day checking the garage and surrounding area of the house for a trapdoor or another entrance exit to the cellar, but couldn't find anything. We put it down to the sheer size and state of the garden and went home. The next few visits to the house was us trying to decide who would enter the cellar first. No one wanted to. And no matter how many games of rock, paper, scissors we played, it was always best out of a higher number. Until one day, I'd had enough. We were sat in a circle in the other room, messing with stuff and just generally chatting. Except me, I just sat and stared at this hole, this dark void in the wall. Finally, I got up, exclaimed my intentions, took the torch from my pocket, and stepped inside. Everyone else quickly and very excitedly followed. Immediately, the first few layers of the wooden steps just disintegrated under my feet. They turned into a mulch of damp splinters that clung to the sole of my shoe when I lifted my foot. It was worrying, but the stairs seemed sturdy enough. Each step I took downwards. The temperature dropped rapidly and the air seemed to get thicker and thicker. The inches of dust that I kicked up didn't help also. Admittedly, I was a little scared, but I had 5 other lads behind me, so it was impossible to turn tail now. I headed down and reached the second to last step. I could see the doorway, which led to an open room. Pausing, I regained my courage with a few shaky, deep breaths and stepped through. The room was in a worse state than the stairs. Webs littered the rafters and floorboards above like moss. They hung from the ceiling in clumps, all tarnished with dust. Weirdly, thinking about it now, we never saw any spiders though. The floor was carpeted in a layer of debris from the rotting wood above, dust and dirt. It was a miracle none of us ever fell through the floor above. This place was a mess. The room was huge, expanding underneath the bathroom and both rooms on the first floor, and it was dark. There was no light source, other than the torches 3 of us now carried. The room stood empty, except for a wooden table smack bang in the middle. No chair, nothing around it, but on it stood a metal plate, crudely bashed into shape, with the remnants of a black goo on it. Next to the plate stood a tall, uncorked green bottle. One of the boys went over to it and picked it up. It sloshed as he did so, with a liquid of deep brown and layers of dirt inside. I never smelled it, but apparently it was putrid. At first, we didn't see the other doorway. It was in the corner directly opposite the one we had entered. No door, just total darkness. We tried to shine our torches through it, but they didn't seem to cut through the shadows. It was like there was actually a door there, one that drained the torchlight. For some reason, I didn't muster the courage to go into that room, and neither did anyone else. We simply turned and left, feeling like we'd had enough adventure for the day. Over the next week or so, we invited girls and other friends to the house, but all refused to enter the basement. We found this hilarious, and would dare one another, more to show off than anything, to go down there either on our own or in pairs, without a flashlight, and see how long we could stay down there. Now, not once did I get scared while stood in complete darkness down there. It was kind of calming, but none of us ever got the courage to enter the other room. In hindsight, we should have questioned more why the door was metal, or why it was locked from the inside and how a fridge got up the stairs and placed in front of the door, as a barrier. From the inside also. But full of excitement and immaturity, it never crossed our minds. We just assumed that there would be some sort of other exit in the other room, which led to the garden. Word quickly went round through the year groups of the O'Brien basement, and we definitely fed the rumors of it being haunted. Teenagers would ask us how to get into the house and for us to show them the barricaded door basement. So, because we thought we were cool, we spent another day making a maze in the garden, squashing pathways down that led away from the garage. We would then invite people into the house, lead them through the garden into the garage, and show them the hole in the stairs. It got quite popular, and we decided to cash in on the opportunity. We told people that if they wanted to see the basement, then they would have to do the initiation. As they came in, we would have one person sat on the fridge and another at the bottom of the stairs, both with torches, and send the people into the first room, telling them that they had to stay in there for 10 minutes, with the torches turned off, and then we would let them out. This went up for a while, and it was fun at first. A lot of people bottled it as soon as the torches were turned off, but some stayed. We cheered them back up the stairs when they completed it. It was a cheesy little ritual we created. But still, everyone refused to go into the other room. When questioned, they just said they didn't feel comfortable, until my little brother and his friend came. They were 2 years younger than us, and initially, we refused to let anyone who wasn't our age into the house. We were there all the time, and there were 6 of us in the friend group, so it was pretty easy to deter people away if they managed to find the entrance at the garage. But after constant pestering and the initial curiosity of others dwindling, we decided to invite them along. We made a big deal out of it, taking them to the dilapidated fence at the back of the garden and tying their jumpers around their faces as we lead them blind through the maze of shrubbery and thorns to the garage. It was a decent drop from the hole in the roof, and even though my brother managed it, his friend had to be lowered down by his arms. Once inside, they were met with the stench of smoke that lingered from the floors above. We walked them through the kitchen and showed them the makeshift entrance to the basement. We told them the story of the metal door and how it didn't make sense, and gave them the option of staying in the first room, in pitch black, for 10 minutes, or go in the second room in pitch black for 5 minutes. An offer a lot of people initially picked until they got down the staircase. Second room, they said in unison. We all laughed, expecting them to change their minds immediately. One of the lads slipped through the hole in the wooden boards and turned right, heading up the stairs and positioning himself on the fridge. I went through next and positioned myself at the foot of the stairs. I'd just like to say, at this point, all of us regulars felt complete comfort going down to the bottom of the stairs, practically alone. We'd all taken it in turns when bringing people down here and had done it numerous times each. So this time was no different. There was a giddy, nervous atmosphere when the 2 youngsters entered the staircase. The torches we used were cheap ones we'd gotten from the market, so they cast an eerie yellow glow. Slowly, my brother and his friend made it down the stairs, clearly attempting to show face and act unmoved by the state of the rotten, decaying wood around them. But as they trenched through the mulch, they stuck close together. They took their time, so much so the guy at the top shouted for them to hurry, and both nearly shit their pants. When they finally got to me, I told them that this was the first room, shining the torch around the room through the doorway, and that they were to go into the next one, aiming my beam through the darkness to the frame of the other door. The room was a decent size, and as stated, the torches were cheap, but I remember taking notice that the beam that cut through the first room never seemed to illuminate the second room at all, as if there was an object obstructing its path. My brother's friend walked into the room, and as my brother walked past me, I grabbed his shoulder and told him that he didn't have to do this. And if he did, then he could back out whenever. With a nod and a dismissive wave, he followed his friend. They crossed the room, passed the table, and disappeared through the second doorway, as if walking through a dark stage curtain. I hit the button on my Casio watch to start the countdown from 5 minutes. I then aimed the beam of my torch up the staircase. The guy sitting on the fridge smiled excitedly and looked at his watch. "I really need to piss, dude. I'll be right back," he said, jumping down and disappearing back through the gap. I stood at the bottom of those steps for what seemed like forever. I could hear the faint giggles from across the first room. They seemed muffled, as if hearing voices from behind a door. "How long left?" my brother's voice shouted. 3.5 minutes, I replied, checking my watch. Now, in the basement, despite it obviously being underground, there was never an uncomfortable temperature. It was colder than upstairs, but had no bite. There was never a chill, and while being down there countless amount of times, not once had any of us felt any sort of breeze. And this memory still haunts me a little, especially when there's a sudden shift in temperature. I noticed that I became very cold, stood at the bottom of the stairs, to the point where I could see my breath when checking the time against the light on my watch face. The mumbles from the other room had stopped also. I tried to focus on them, see if I could hear any movement or the nervous noises they had been making before, but nothing. I remember getting freaked out. I don't know what about, but I could feel my heart beating faster. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood on end. "Yo, you guys alright?" I called out. Nothing. No reply. "Oh, stop fucking about. Time's up," I called again. And again, no reply. I shone the torch through the doorway of the second room. But just like before, it was as if the beam cut through the first room and then stopped at the doorway. I crept closer, calling my brother's name, but he never replied. Then, as clear as day, so loud it hurt my ears after the silence, a voice, deep, brash, and distorted, as if the sound had been twisted, bellowed. "Leave now." I froze on the spot, eyes fixated on the doorway. Then, emerging from the gloom, ran my brother and his friend, both as white as snow, both with tears and snot streaming down their faces. The look of pure terror on their faces is something I have never been able to get rid of. They bolted straight past me, which snapped me out of the trance, and I followed suit. Before we could reach the doorway to the stairs, the sound of crashing came from the stairwell. 4 ridiculously loud bangs, and the noise of snapping wood. The fridge was embedded into the wall at the bottom of the staircase. Without stopping, we all scrambled over it. The staircase itself was a complete mess. Large splinters of wood stuck up like spikes. Luckily, and I don't know how, we managed to clamber up on our hands and feet without injury. Halfway up, I looked towards the hole in the wall, praying it would be in reaching distance. Both the young lads were in front of me, both sobbing and screaming. Both ran straight past the hole in the wall. The metal door, locked before and with no key. We looked everywhere for it, stood open. Light from the garage exit spilled through the kitchen and down into the basement, as if it showed us the quickest way out. Instinct had set in by this point, and all 3 of us darted through the door, onto the table, and up through the garage. My brother's friend, too small to get down on his own, managed to get out without help. We ran through the garden maze. At some point, I had to grab hold of my brother to stop him from going down one of the many dead ends we had created, and without word, took the lead. We raced to the fence, squeezed through the hole, and collapsed on the field behind the property. I looked around, and there, also sat on the grass, staring at the 3 of us, was everyone else who had been in the house. No one said a word. Everyone looked as scared as each other, except for the 2 younger boys. They wept, for a long time actually, as we all just sat there in silence and let them do it. Once they had stopped, we all got up, without a word, and went home. My brother said nothing to me on the way, or when we got back. He went into his room. I went into his room. I went into his room. I went into mine, and that was the... No one went into the house again. It stood for a year or 2, then was demolished. Apparently, one of the daughters had finally come over and claimed the land, only to sell it to some new build project. Now, a group of houses sit where the garden and house were. Nice looking houses, to be fair. My brother still refuses to walk past that estate. They never built on the land directly above the cellar. Apparently, and I've never actually had this confirmed, but the builders refused to fill the cellar in for some reason. Just bricked it up and left it as open space, despite being able to fit a perfectly good house on there. We only brought it up once within the friends group, and only because I convinced myself that it had been one of them that had opened the door somehow and moved the fridge, but they all swore it wasn't. They said that as soon as it started getting really cold in the house, they got spooked. They heard the voice and headed for the kitchen. Noticed the door was open when they heard the loud bangs and bolted. I tried asking my brother about the room, but he completely shut down when I did. He quickly stopped being friends with the kid who went down with him. Said they no longer had anything relevant to talk about. There are pictures that show the house after the fire. You can see the smashed window from the fire brigade and the black from the smoke around the top windows. The garage is behind. Can't see it in the photo. Also photos of the cleared land and of the new build with the obvious patch of grass where the basement would be.